August 1943. Somewhere in occupied France, a strange kind of victory was unfolding. On a quiet Luftwaffe airfield, the ground crew gathered around what looked more like a joke than a triumph. There it sat, its wings broad and heavy, its body swollen like a steel barrel, an American P-47 Thunderbolt, captured almost intact after its pilot was forced down. For months, German pilots had reported encounters with this bulky monster in the sky, a machine that shouldn't have been able to climb, turn, or even fly the way it did. Now, for the first time, they could touch it. Engineers and officers called it intelligence gold, but to one man, it would soon become something else entirely, a revelation that felt less like victory and more like prophecy. Oberleutnant Vener Schulz, Chief Technical Officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, arrived with the calm precision of a man who trusted equations more than instincts. He had seen countless enemy aircraft before, some crude, others clever, but none had stirred this kind of curiosity. As he walked toward the Thunderbolt, its olive-drab surface scorched and dented, the air smelled of burnt oil and damp metal. Pilots standing nearby smirked, calling it Die fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. Schulz wrote a single word in his notebook, grotesque. It looked like a mistake that somehow stayed airborne. Yet he'd learned long ago that the sky rarely rewarded appearances. What mattered was the math hidden inside. The first inspection changed everything. Up close, the P-47 was colossal, nearly 8 tons of machinery, almost twice the weight of Germany's prized FW-190. The fuselage seemed overbuilt, the frame oversized, the cowling almost absurdly wide. Any German engineer would have called it inefficient. Schulz didn't. He saw something else in those thick plates and massive joints: confidence. This was not a machine designed on the edge of scarcity. It was designed from abundance. When his team pulled off the cowling, silence fell over the hangar. The heart of the beast, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, filled the space like an industrial cathedral. 18 cylinders in 2 perfect rows of 9, glimmering under the harsh overhead lights. Schulz leaned closer, running his hand along the polished aluminum casing. Every component looked machined to impossible tolerances. No warware compromises, no signs of the resource shortages that haunted German factories. He began calculating displacement, airflow, compression ratios. The numbers told a story he didn't want to believe. 2,000 horsepower, maybe more. By comparison, the BMW 801 powering their FW-190 barely reached 1,700, and that was with constant maintenance and the best mechanics Germany could offer. The Americans, it seemed, were building stronger engines with less struggle, and in greater numbers. One of his mechanics whistled softly. "Each cylinder removable on its own," he said, pointing. "If one fails, you replace just that one." Schulz nodded slowly. It was simple brilliance, maintenance by design. In Germany, major repairs meant disassembly, downtime, and lost aircraft. This system assumed something different, that machines would be pushed hard, fixed quickly, and sent back into the air. The logic was industrial, not romantic. These people weren't designing for individual pilots. They were designing for an endless production line. Then came the part that truly unsettled him: the ducting, the strange network of pipes weaving down the fuselage like veins. He traced them with his eyes until he reached the rear compartment and froze. There, gleaming faintly under layers of heat shielding, was a turbine. The Americans had done it, a full-scale turbo-supercharger system, driven by exhaust gases and capable of spinning at speeds that would tear inferior materials apart. The turbine compressed thin air at high altitude, feeding it back to the engine with a precision that made the P-47's bulk suddenly make sense. It wasn't heavy by mistake, it was heavy on purpose. Schulz's pencil tapped against his notebook. "Can we replicate this?" one of his assistants asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He thought of the shortages, the missing alloys, the factories already pushed past breaking point. Then he shook his head. "Not with what we have. Not now." The words sounded final even to him. The realization was simple but devastating. America wasn't just making good planes. It was making machines that Germany physically couldn't build. When they moved to the fuselage, the pattern repeated: Cannon shells had punched holes through the body, machine gun rounds had scarred the wings, yet the Thunderbolt had landed intact. Its skin was thick, its internal skeleton layered with reinforcements, its control systems redundant. Even damaged, it could still fly. In Luftwaffe reports, pilots described shooting at these things until their guns overheated, only to watch them climb away, trailing smoke but refusing to fall. Schulz finally saw why. The design philosophy was alien. Where Germany sought agility, America built resilience. The radial engine alone could take punishment that would destroy a liquid-cooled inline power plant. Even with multiple cylinders gone, the P-47 could limp home. To Schulz, it wasn't a fighter. It was a flying fortress in miniature. He thought the airframe was over-engineered until he saw the guns. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, perfectly synchronized. He did the math again, more than 100 rounds every second, each projectile heavy enough to shred control surfaces and armor alike. A 2-second burst could turn a nimble fighter into wreckage. German aircraft carried less ammunition, fewer weapons, and relied on precision marksmanship. The Thunderbolt required none of that. It fired a wall of lead that made precision irrelevant. Against something like this, survival was probability, not skill. By the time Schulz finished his inspection, the picture was painfully clear. Every system, the engine, the supercharger, the armor, the firepower, spoke of a country fighting a different kind of war. He requested production data from intelligence reports. When the figures arrived, he could barely process them. Republic Aviation was building over 500 P-47's every month. Plans existed to reach 700. Each aircraft required more materials and man-hours than anything Germany could dream of. Yet the Americans were scaling up as if effort had no limit. He ran the ratios. 1 American fighter for every 3 German, but twice the power, twice the durability. Then came the engine numbers. 125,000 R-2800's produced during the war. That was more than half of Germany's total engine output across all types. Schulz spent the night compiling his report, the lamplight flickering across pages filled with equations and quiet dread. His conclusion was as dangerous as it was accurate. Germany could not win an industrial war against the United States. The document went up the chain of command. Weeks later, he heard it had been dismissed. Defeatists, they said, demoralized by propaganda. The leadership wanted victories, not mathematics. They believed ideology could outfly machinery. But as months passed, the skies themselves began to echo his warning. P-47's appeared in greater numbers, their engines howling above bomber streams, their guns tearing through formations that once felt secure. German losses mounted, pilots vanished, and the factories could no longer replace them. Schulz stopped keeping tallies. He had already seen the future on that airfield. After the war, sitting across from American intelligence officers, he was asked if he'd truly predicted defeat from a single aircraft. Schulz smiled faintly. Not defeat, he said, reality. The P-47 was proof that America was fighting a war we couldn't even enter, a war of industry, not ideology. The officer nodded. In captured files, Schulz's report had been stamped and filed away with a single line. No action required. He wasn't surprised. Truth had never been Germany's problem. Listening to it was. The Thunderbolt had been more than a fighter. It was a mirror held up to an empire built on illusion. Beneath its armor and power lay the quiet certainty that numbers, not slogans, decide the sky. And in August 1943, on a lonely airstrip in France, one engineer had already read the outcome in the polished metal of an enemy machine. The P-47 sat under the August sun like some overfed creature that had lost its way to the battlefield. Its broad wings cast a heavy shadow across the cracked tarmac, and its nose seemed almost comically round compared to the sleek German machines lined up nearby. Pilots passing by couldn't help but laugh at it, an American brute that looked more like a factory boiler with wings than a weapon of war. To the Luftwaffe's eyes, it was an insult to aerodynamics. Yet to Oberleutnant Vener Schulz, standing quietly with a clipboard in hand, laughter felt misplaced. The longer he stared at the Thunderbolt, the more he felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name. It was massive, 8 tons fully loaded, twice the weight of their own Focke-Wulf 190. The German fighter was sharp, compact, and purposeful, like a rapier built for precision. The Thunderbolt was a hammer. Everything about it seemed excessive: the thickness of its skin, the depth of its frame, the size of its wheels. To any ordinary observer, it was proof that American engineers didn't understand elegance. To Schulz, it was proof they didn't care. He took out his notebook, already smudged with graphite, and began scribbling figures: wing area, power-to-weight ratio, fuel capacity. He wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for logic, and slowly, that logic began to reveal itself. This aircraft wasn't shaped by whim, but by mathematics. The Americans had built for endurance, not grace. Where the Luftwaffe had refined performance until it teetered on the edge of fragility, the Americans had gone the other way. They built something that could absorb abuse and still bring its pilot home. The more Schulz calculated, the quieter the airfield seemed to grow. The weight made sense. The armor, the size, the heavy framing, all demanded one thing in return: power. Somewhere inside that steel cocoon was an engine that made it possible, that justified the bulk. The thought sent a small chill through him. If the Americans had managed to match their excess in mass with equal excess in horsepower, this machine might not be grotesque at all. It might be revolutionary. He closed his notebook, adjusted his cap, and nodded to his crew. "Let's open it," he said simply. The mechanics moved in, loosening the bolts that held the cowling in place. A hiss of released air escaped, followed by the metallic scent of oil and carbon. The heavy cover came off with a dull clang, and for a moment, no one spoke. There it was, the heart of the beast. A circular wall of cylinders, dense and gleaming, filling every inch of available space. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders in 2 perfect rows, each one a small engine in itself, each machined with such precision that the light seemed to slide evenly across their polished faces. Schulz stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. The bolts, the welds, the polish, none of it carried the desperation he had come to expect from late-war manufacturing. This was not an engine built under pressure or shortage. It was built with time, care, and confidence. Someone muttered behind him, "It's enormous, twice the size of ours." Schulz didn't answer. He was too busy tracing the system of pipes and wires, understanding how everything connected. He wasn't looking at a machine anymore. He was looking at an idea. Germany's engineers had been forced to balance on a knife's edge, shaving grams and cutting corners. The Americans had done the opposite. They had built a fighter that wasn't afraid of its own weight, one that demanded more power and got it. As the mechanics wiped their hands and exchanged quiet jokes about American overkill, Schulz just stared. His pencil hung motionless above the page. In the margins of his calculations, he wrote a single line: "If this is the standard, we are already behind." He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the numbers had already begun to whisper the truth. The engine filled the hangar like a secret the war had been keeping. 18 cylinders arranged in perfect symmetry, each machined with a precision that bordered on arrogance. Schulz bent forward, the metallic scent of oil and hot aluminum hanging thick in the air. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, he'd read about it in intercepted reports, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The thing was enormous, alive even in silence, as if it was built to devour the sky itself. He ran his hand along the smooth casing. Every seam was tight, every rivet exact. No uneven casting, no signs of rushed assembly. It was a level of consistency that told its own story, not about engineers, but about the nation behind them. Germany's factories were now haunted by shortages, low-grade alloys, and forced improvisations. This machine, by contrast, reeked of abundance. Its materials were top-tier, its craftsmanship was almost indulgent. It wasn't designed under pressure, it was designed with certainty. Schulz's pencil began to scratch across the page. Displacement, compression, horsepower. The numbers climbed higher with every calculation. 2,000 horsepower at least, maybe more if the Americans were feeding it pressurized air as the rumors claimed. That single figure stopped him cold. 2,000 horsepower wasn't just strength, it was strategy. It explained everything: the weight, the bulk, the massive propeller that looked absurd to German eyes. The P-47 wasn't inefficient, it was unapologetically powerful. One of his men leaned in, wiping a smudge of grease from his hand. "The crankshaft," he said softly. "It's a work of art." Schulz nodded. The metallurgy was beyond anything they could easily replicate. Perfect balance, flawless bearings, materials that showed no trace of compromise. The BMW engines back home struggled to hold tolerances at scale. The Americans, it seemed, were not only maintaining them, but mass-producing them without losing precision. Then Schulz noticed something odd, a series of thick ducts snaking away from the engine, running deep into the fuselage. He frowned, following them with his eyes. They shouldn't be there, not in this configuration. Not if the Americans were using a standard supercharger. He crouched beside the fuselage, tracing the conduits with his fingers. They disappeared toward the tail, wrapped in heat shielding. That's when it hit him. This was no ordinary power plant. Somewhere inside this airframe, something was hiding, something that changed the rules. He straightened slowly, staring at the Thunderbolt as if seeing it for the first time. The absurd bulk, the heavy structure, the oversized frame, it all made sense now. This aircraft wasn't built around an engine. It was built around a system, a secret. He looked at his assistants who waited for an explanation. "This," he said quietly, "is not just horsepower, it's a factory in the sky." Schulz didn't yet know what awaited him at the end of those ducts, but instinct told him it wasn't a simple trick of engineering. Whatever it was, it explained how this flying anvil could climb past 20,000 feet and still fight as if it were at sea level. The puzzle was only beginning to unfold, and with every revelation, the quiet certainty inside him grew heavier. The enemy wasn't just ahead in the air, they were ahead everywhere. The moment they opened the rear fuselage panel, the mystery revealed itself, and so did the nightmare. Behind the firewall, beneath layers of carefully riveted aluminum, ran a labyrinth of pipes and ducts, gleaming faintly with heat-resistant polish. Schulz followed them with a small flashlight, the beam tracing the impossible. A turbine. Not a simple blower or mechanical compressor, but a true exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger. It was the kind of device German engineers had once dreamed of perfecting, but had quietly abandoned. Now, here it was, humming softly even in silence, as if mocking them with its presence. He crouched lower, examining the system like a surgeon studying alien anatomy. Exhaust gases from the R-2800 were routed backward through heat-proof channels to spin a turbine operating at speeds exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. That turbine, in turn, drove a compressor, feeding dense, pressurized air back into the engine's intake. The cycle was elegant, efficient, and almost impossible to replicate under German conditions. The entire assembly required materials that didn't buckle under extreme heat, bearings that could spin endlessly without seizing, and tolerances that left no room for human error. Schulz knew that turbo-supercharging wasn't a new idea. Germany had tried it. They had built prototypes, conducted tests, even sketched out integration plans for their high-altitude fighters. But the challenges had always outpaced reality. The alloys couldn't handle the temperature, the machining wasn't precise enough, the labor wasn't skilled enough, or simply wasn't there anymore. The Reich had chosen the simpler path: mechanical superchargers, smaller gains, and constant compromises. Looking at the P-47, Schulz realized the Americans had solved every one of those problems, and then mass-produced the solution. "This isn't experimental," he murmured, half to himself. "This is factory work." That thought was worse than any technical revelation. The Americans weren't just innovating, they were industrializing innovation. They had made complexity routine. He ran a finger across the smooth metal of the turbine housing. No war-worn corners, no shortcuts, no mismatched alloys. Every curve spoke of uniformity. Every weld spoke of abundance. The Americans had achieved something Germany couldn't dream of anymore. They could afford perfection. The implications were terrifying. With this system, the P-47's engine could maintain its full 2,000 horsepower, well above 25,000 feet, where most German fighters gasped for air and lost their edge. The Luftwaffe's prized Bf-109s and W-190s became sluggish, starved of oxygen, their mechanical superchargers unable to keep up. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, was just getting started, faster, stronger, and perfectly suited to the high-altitude realm where bombers roamed. One of the mechanics broke the silence. "If we had this, if we could make it—" His voice trailed off as Schulz turned toward him. "We can't," he said quietly. "Not now, not with what's left of our industry." He didn't need to explain. Everyone there understood the numbers even if they hadn't written them down. Germany's factories were already stretched thin, its skilled workers pulled to the front, its alloys rationed to the gram. To produce something like this would mean rebuilding the entire industrial chain, from smelting plants to precision mills. It was no longer a question of engineering, but of survival. As Schulz stood, brushing the dust from his hands, the air around him felt heavier. The realization sank in with the weight of inevitability. The Americans had already crossed a threshold Germany couldn't follow. The Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft, it was a declaration of what modern war had become. This wasn't about pilots or tactics anymore. It was about foundries, factories, and furnaces. And in that kind of war, no amount of courage could make up the difference. They gathered around the open fuselage like men staring at a forbidden map. Schulz said nothing for a long time, only listened, to the faint creak of metal cooling, to the rustle of notes as his assistants waited for a verdict. One finally broke the silence. "Herr Oberleutnant, could we build one?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Schulz exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in resignation. "Not with what we have," he said at last. "Not even close." He pointed to the turbine housing they'd just examined, the fine threaded bolts gleaming under the workshop lights. "This part alone would take days of machining. Every tolerance here is exact to a fraction of a millimeter. That's not craftsmanship, it's automation. Precision on an industrial scale." He stepped back, gesturing toward the engine. "We're still crafting our machines. They're manufacturing theirs." The difference sounded small, but it wasn't. Germany's aircraft industry had become a compromise machine. Design brilliance crushed under material shortages and bomb supply lines. Factories were forced to substitute aluminum with lower-grade alloys, to simplify castings, to accept imperfection because there was no time to correct it. Yet this American engine, this hulking mechanical heart, showed no sign of urgency or fear. It was built the right way, not the possible way. He noted the bearing quality, the purity of the steel, the polish of the crankshaft. High-grade alloys, multiple machining passes, precise balancing. "Do you know how many man-hours this takes?" he asked his crew, though it wasn't really a question. "Thousands, skilled ones, not laborers dragged from occupied factories, not apprentices learning on broken lathes." He closed his notebook. "We'd need more machinists than soldiers." The men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a mechanic from Bremen, spoke quietly. "They're not smarter than us, sir." Schulz nodded. "No," he said, "but they have more everything." He looked back at the P-47, its panels removed, its bones exposed. Inside, every cable and bracket looked deliberate. No excess, no negligence. Even the rivets were aligned with geometric precision. It wasn't artistry, it was consistency, a kind of mechanical discipline that could only exist in a nation unburdened by scarcity. Germany was fighting an engineer's nightmare, trying to outthink a rival that could outproduce. As he moved along the fuselage, Schulz felt the weight of realization deepen. If this was how the Americans built an engine, what would the rest of the machine look like? The skin, the frame, the control systems. Each one would tell its own story of power, and probably of punishment. He ran a hand over the thick aluminum plating, scarred from cannon shells, but still stubbornly intact. "This isn't clever," he muttered, half to himself. "It's confident." There was a strange kind of beauty in that, the confidence of a nation that didn't need to gamble on innovation because it could afford to perfect repetition. Every component inside the P-47 reflected a quiet, brutal truth. When you can build without compromise, you don't need to improvise. Schulz turned to his assistants, his expression unreadable. "Let's see how much damage this thing can take," he said. And with that, the investigation moved from power to punishment. The first thing they noticed wasn't how much damage the Thunderbolt had taken, it was how little it seemed to care. The fuselage bore deep scars, jagged holes where cannon shells had torn through, streaks of burned paint, dents that would have crippled a German fighter. Yet the aircraft sat upright, defiant, as if it had simply decided not to fall. Schulz crouched beside a rupture in the wing, running his hand along the torn metal. The edges were clean, the structure behind them unbroken. 20-millimeter hits, he murmured. At least 3, and it still flew back. He stood and examined the internal framing. The Americans hadn't built this thing to dance. They'd built it to survive. The skin was thicker, the ribs denser, and the rivets spaced with mathematical precision to distribute impact. Beneath the surface, Schulz found layer upon layer of redundancy, backup cables, dual hydraulic lines, multiple control linkages that could take over if the primary ones were destroyed. It was the opposite of German design philosophy. The Luftwaffe demanded agility, speed, and economy of weight. Every gram was trimmed, every ounce accounted for. The P-47 didn't care about that. It was overbuilt in every sense, but that excess gave it something German fighters had never truly possessed: forgiveness. The cockpit told the same story. Thick armor plates lined the pilot's seat like a small fortress. The windscreen, 3 layers of bullet-resistant glass, was so dense that Schulz could see his own reflection in it. He imagined a pilot flying through tracer fire, bullets hammering the canopy, and realized this man would likely live to see home again. On the battlefield, that changed everything. A German pilot might win 3 engagements before being lost to a lucky shot. An American one could fight 10, 20, and still walk away. Experience was compounding for them and vanishing for Germany. But the real revelation came when Schulz returned to the engine. The radial design that had once seemed ridiculous now made cruel sense. A liquid-cooled German engine relied on delicate tubing, coolant pumps, and radiators that turned a single puncture into catastrophe. The P-47's radial had no such weakness. Even with a few cylinders shredded, it would keep running. The enormous metal disc at the front wasn't just an engine, it was armor. A built-in shield that took the first hit and shrugged it off. Reports had described Thunderbolts limping home, with whole chunks of the cowling missing, still powered, still airborne. He had dismissed those accounts as exaggeration. Now, looking at the evidence in front of him, he believed every word. "This machine," one of the engineers said, "it's too much." Schulz didn't answer right away. He studied the repair diagrams pinned to the side of the fuselage, notations made by German mechanics cataloging every hit, every system that still functioned despite the abuse. "Not too much," he said finally, "just more than we can afford." It was over-engineered, yes, but it was also practical in its own brutal way. Each extra millimeter of armor, each redundant line, each unnecessary kilogram existed because the Americans could afford to build it that way. They had engines powerful enough to carry the weight, factories strong enough to mass-produce it, and pilots numerous enough to fly it. Germany, stretched thin and starving for materials, had no such luxury. Schulz stepped back, his gaze following the battered wings. "If it can take this kind of punishment," he said quietly, "then I want to see what kind of punishment it delivers." He motioned to the mechanics. "Open the wings." The men moved quickly, removing panels and exposing the internal gun bays. The heavy covers fell away with a metallic clang, and the dim light glinted off 8 black steel barrels, 4 in each wing, perfectly aligned, cold, and waiting. In that moment, even before a single round was fired, Schulz understood that survival wasn't the Thunderbolt's only talent. It could hit back with the fury of an entire squadron. When Schulz finally stared into the empty gun bays, the cold geometry of American firepower became a language he could read. 8 barrels sat there like the teeth of a machine meant to chew through formations, not pick off lone targets. The loading manifests tucked into the wing wells confirmed it, roughly 400 rounds allocated to each gun. Do the simple math and the scale hits you. 8's 400, Schulz 32,100 rounds stowed aboard a single fighter. That ammunition wasn't symbolic, it was operational doctrine turned into metal. The combined cyclic rate the crew measured, just over 100 rounds every second when all guns fired together, meant the Thunderbolt could spray a storm of lead downrange. Again, the arithmetic is stark. 3,200, 100, over 32 seconds of continuous fire before the magazines were empty. In practice, pilots didn't hold the trigger that long. Tactical bursts of 1 to 3 seconds were the norm. Still, a 1-second burst would place over 100 heavy projectiles into the convergence cone. A 2-second pass doubled that. Chances of walking away from such a hit, Schulz realized, were a matter of luck, not skill. The implications for air combat doctrine were immediate and brutal. German doctrine prized maneuver, deflection shooting, and surgical strikes. Make the shot count, then escape. The Thunderbolt rewrote that script. Its approach reduced the premium on perfect marksmanship. It turned good enough aiming into mass effect. Put the target broadly in front of the guns and let volume finish the job. For a nation that had long sown its performance through careful engineering economies, the American recipe was the opposite. Compensate for any single weakness with overwhelming repetition. Tactically, Schulz's notes grew terse. Engage from below and behind. Never close beam on. Use high-speed slashing passes at oblique angles to shorten exposure time. Make the fight a hit-and-run ballet rather than a slugging match. Yet every recommended evasive maneuver assumed pilots who could be spared and aircraft that could survive the gambit, both in ever-diminishing supply. The math of survival now had a logistics term entwined with it. How often could you rotate a pilot through combat? And how often could factories replace the machines he lost? There was also the psychological toll. Facing a wall of synchronized 50s changed behavior. Pilots who once trusted a single burst to disable an enemy learned instead to fear being caught in the cone for even a second. That fear shortened exposure, but it also reduced opportunities for decisive action. Experience, which had been a pilot's greatest multiplier, began to erode. The veteran who survived one engagement might not see the next, because attrition outpaced replacement. In a war where numbers compounded advantage, volume of fire and volume of machines created their own momentum. Schulz closed the wing panel and recorded one final cold observation. The P-47 did not merely inflict damage, it shifted the strategic arithmetic. Where skill had mattered most, quantity began to dominate. Where pilots had once traded mastery for narrow superiority, the battlefield now favored those who could afford to brute force victory. And in that ledger, the Thunderbolt was written not as an isolated weapon, but as a single, loud digit in a much larger sum. The deeper Schulz went into the numbers, the more they stopped feeling like statistics and started feeling like casualties. The production data that came through intelligence channels didn't just paint a grim picture, it obliterated the illusion of balance. By the summer of 1943, Republic Aviation was turning out more than 500 P-47 Thunderbolts every month, and the figure was climbing. There were reports, credible ones, that American planners intended to push towards 7 or even 800. He tried to imagine that many machines rolling off assembly lines at once. The rhythmic thunder of engines being tested in rows, the metallic chorus of factories that never slept. It was impossible to reconcile with what he saw every day in Germany. Workshops lit by dim bulbs, workers rationing materials, machines silenced by bombing raids. He shifted his focus to the engines, the R-2800s that had impressed and unsettled him. The totals were staggering, over 100,000 already produced, and the line wasn't slowing. Each one represented 2,000 horsepower, an industrial heartbeat stronger than anything in the Reich's arsenal, and they weren't reserved for one aircraft. The same engine powered multiple fighters, bombers, and transports. The Americans were building families of machines around standardized power plants, treating design like a modular equation instead of an artisanal craft. It was mechanical efficiency weaponized. Schulz's pencil hovered over the paper as he compared the ratios. For every German fighter that left a factory, 3 American aircraft took to the air. But the disparity wasn't just numerical. Each American machine was heavier, more complex, and far more resource-intensive. A single B-17 bomber, for instance, consumed the same aluminum and labor as several Bf-109s combined, yet thousands of them filled Allied airfields. The numbers didn't just lean toward America, they crashed down like a verdict. He broke the figures down by resource. Aluminum? Germany was salvaging it from wreckage. The United States was mining, refining, and shipping it by the ton. Fuel? The Reich rationed synthetic blends while the Americans drilled oceans of crude. Machine tools? German production lines reused worn equipment. American factories built new lathes just to build better lathes. And labor, the quiet foundation of every airplane, was the most unequal comparison of all. The Reich had conscripts and forced labor, frightened hands turning out desperate machines. The United States had trained engineers, paid workers, and a system that rewarded precision with pride. Schulz closed his eyes and saw what the war had become. Not a contest of pilots, but a contest of industrial breathing capacity. Germany was gasping. America was expanding its lungs. His technical mind translated that reality into inevitability. In an equation where output multiplied experience, every loss Germany suffered subtracted more than a machine. It subtracted irreplaceable time. The Americans, by contrast, could make good any loss before the smoke cleared. He drafted his report with the blunt honesty of a man who understood he was writing into a void. His recommendations were no longer about tactics. They were about survival. Avoid high-altitude engagement, preserve pilots, shift production to simpler, repairable designs. Focus on defensive action rather than prolonged encounters. Reading the list aloud sounded like triage, the best ways to slow a decline that couldn't be stopped. When he finished, he looked at the cover page and felt the familiar chill of reality colliding with ideology. In Berlin, men who had never held a wrench or climbed into a cockpit still believed willpower could outweigh tonnage. They spoke of spirit, faith, destiny. Schulz spoke of fuel consumption rates, alloy strength, and hours per engine block. He knew which side of that argument reality would obey, but he also knew which side the regime would choose to hear. As he packed his notes and stared one last time at the gutted Thunderbolt, he no longer saw a captured trophy. He saw a factory on wings, a symbol of the kind of war Germany could never truly fight. The report was finished at dawn. Schulz had written it with the precision of an engineer and the restraint of a man who knew the consequences of honesty. His handwriting was neat, his conclusions unambiguous. Avoid high-altitude combat, minimize engagement with Thunderbolts, preserve aircraft through ambush and withdrawal. The final line was simple, almost clinical. Continued direct confrontation will result in unsustainable losses. It was not despair, it was math. But in the atmosphere of 1943 Berlin, math could be mistaken for betrayal. When his commanding officer read it, he didn't argue. He only sighed, folded the pages, and said quietly, "You know what this will sound like to them." Schulz nodded. He knew. Within weeks, the document was filed, marked overly pessimistic, and buried under reports that promised victory was still possible. Headquarters didn't want conclusions. They wanted confirmation. They wanted to believe that the war could still be won with courage, that the Reich's engineers could outwit the flood of American metal pouring from across the ocean. Back at the airfield, Schulz continued his inspections, but the work felt hollow. Every new American aircraft that appeared over Europe repeated the same lesson in a louder voice. First, the P-47's came in 2s and 3s, then in squadrons, then in waves so dense they darkened the sky. German pilots climbed to intercept and found themselves clawing at ghosts, engines that didn't choke, guns that didn't jam, armor that didn't yield. The attrition curve he had calculated on paper was now visible in the contrails overhead. One by one, the Luftwaffe's veterans disappeared, replaced by boys barely out of training. The few who survived spoke of walls of fire, of the constant thunderous presence of the same grotesque machine that refused to die. By 1944, Schulz no longer needed to update his notes. The war was doing it for him. Each report, each loss, each quiet telegram from the front was another entry in the same equation. He had predicted a war of exhaustion. What he witnessed was a war of erasure. The Thunderbolt was not a weapon. It was a factory's voice made audible, repeating the same sentence over and over. You cannot outfly production. Years later, after the surrender, the numbers finally reached him in black and white. They confirmed what he had always suspected. His estimates had been too low. Over 15,000 P-47's produced. Over 300,000 aircraft built by the United States in total. Even at the height of bombing and strain, American manufacturing never faltered, never diluted its quality, never ran dry. The same engines he'd studied, the R-2800's, rolled off production lines by the hundreds of thousands. their precision unbroken to the end. When American officers interviewed him after the war, they were fascinated by his old report. One asked, almost incredulous, "Did you really know all that from one plane?" Schulz smiled faintly. "Not from one plane," he said, "from how it was built. You can read a nation's future in its machines." The Thunderbolt had been his revelation, a grotesque, graceless thing that proved beauty in war was a luxury only the losing could afford. It had taught him that ideology could design dreams, but only industry could sustain them. The Reich had built fighters. America had built systems. One nation fought with pilots. The other fought with factories. The lesson outlived the war. Every chart, every production log, every forgotten page in his confiscated report whispered the same immutable law. Bravery may fill the skies, but steel decides who owns them. The Thunderbolt became the proof. Where others saw a fat, ungainly brawler, Schulz had seen something closer to destiny, a machine that turned mathematics into victory. And so, history closed its ledger not on a battlefield, but in the quiet arithmetic of production lines. When truth was dismissed as defeatism, when ideology silenced engineers, the outcome had already been sealed. The war's end had been written the moment that captured P-47 touched down in France, an ending forged not in courage or luck, but in the relentless logic of industry.